Right. Does anyone here have a favourite book?
Harry Potter.
Harry Potter?
Brave New World.
Sorry.
Brave New World.
Candide.
Mr. Fox.
Sorry.
Fantastic Mr.
That's
Fox.
Mr. Fox.
Candide.
Sorry, Candy.
Yeah.
I haven't read that either. There's always things I haven't read.
Inheritance.
Inheritance. By...
Christopher Howling.
Okay, let's try it. Okay. Well, I'm here to talk to you about one of my favourite books. This is the Autobiography of Malcolm X. When I remember the really good books I've read, I always recall quite vivid memories of what was going on in my life at the time I read the books. I remember reading a biography about JFK when I worked in a quirky small business in a basement, sitting in between two races. I remember reading True Grit, and I got the good news, that's how I got onto my current course at Bristol University. But that paved the way for me to leave my soul-destroying job. In November 2008, I was sitting on a park bench in Rockefeller Plaza in New York City. I was simultaneously stuffing my face in McDonald's and reading Jarhead by Anthony Swadford. All of a sudden, I raised my head to see what the commotion was. The crowd around me went wild in celebration. The US had elected its first black president, Barack Obama. The summer of 2008 was not a high point in my life. It had been nearly a year since I'd graduated from Bristol Uni. I was unemployed and pretty disillusioned with the way things were turning out. To top it off, I ended up living what I can only politely describe as a cosy room in the not-too-cosy part of Southmead. That is to say, impolitely, it was a dump. My life revolved around the daily pilgrimage to the job centre, and my bi-weekly appointments to see if I was doing all I could to get employed. For that, I was rewarded with a few condescending remarks from a job centre employee, and then I get my job seekers allowance for another 2 weeks. After that, I was usually calling at the job agencies, walk back home, that's how much time I had on my hands. Then I'd email out my CVs and covering letters as necessary. By then it was still morning. Like I said, I had a lot of time on my hands. Much of the time I used for reading. I used to walk outside to Hallfield Common, which is a lovely park in the summer. I used to sit on the bench and read there for hours at a time. It was around this time I found the Autobiography of Malcolm X by chance. It was lying on the floor in the room that my housemate had just left. The landlord didn't have any contact details for the housemate, and I needed something to read, so it worked out quite nicely. I'd only heard a little bit about Malcolm X before I read the book. I knew he was an African American concerned with civil rights here in America, but not a huge amount more than that. I was interested enough to give the book a whirl. Well, reading the book certainly put my problems into perspective. Malcolm X, or Malcolm Little as he was known in his early life, had what I can only loosely describe as a difficult upbringing. He was born on 19th of May 1925 in Omaha, Nebraska. Malcolm Little lived in fear of racist violence throughout his childhood from a local mob called the Black Legion. His father died under mysterious circumstances when Malcolm was just 6. The Black Legion were thought by his family to be responsible. Malcolm X and his siblings were sent off to individual foster homes when his mum suffered a nervous breakdown. But this was not the real low point in Malcolm's life. That came when a teacher at school asked Malcolm what he wanted to do with his life. Malcolm said he wanted to be a lawyer. The teacher said no, he couldn't be one. The reason he gave, and that Malcolm directly quoted, was that Malcolm was a nigger. From then on, Malcolm was given a harsh taste of what was expected of him as a black man in the American social order before civil rights. He acted accordingly and soon fell into a life of crime and drug abuse. Prison in many ways saved Malcolm's life. Malcolm met a minister from the Nation of Islam, a religious movement that promoted black self-reliance and unity. The nation taught him not to hate himself and ignore the propaganda that white ruled society bombarded on the black man. Malcolm gave up his past drug abuse and adhered to the nation's strict moral code. He gave up alcohol and the consumption of pork. He was encouraged to get educated so he had the power to challenge white myths about the black man. When he left prison, he became a fiery speaker. He encouraged African Americans to get angry about the social order that had been imposed on them, made only possible by their ancestors being kidnapped from their homes in Africa and enslaved by the white man. We didn't land at Plymouth Rock, he said. Plymouth Rock landed on us. The media called him the angriest man in America. When he argued in favour of black rifle clubs, the media called him an extremist, even though he advocated these in a nation full of white-only rifle clubs. Malcolm soon rejected his surname Little, since, as he saw it, his true African surname was lost forever. He ceased to be Malcolm Little and became Malcolm X. But eventually Malcolm began to realise that the movement that had given him a chance at redemption was ultimately corrupt. Muhammad Elijah, the leader of the nation, was found by Malcolm X to be abusing his position to impregnate many young women in the movement. His justification for this was that he needed to sire an heir. Malcolm was left in a position of conflicted loyalties between his conscience and the movement. In the end, he chose his conscience. So Malcolm broke away from the Nation of Islam. After he did, he began to question their extremist ethos. When he went on the Muslim pilgrimage to Saudi Arabia, the Hajj, he began to believe that the white man and the black man could coexist peacefully. There on the journey, he experienced rare acts of kindness from white people. When he got back, the Nation of Islam at first tried to destroy Malcolm's credibility. Eventually, they tried to destroy him. Sadly, they eventually succeeded. Malcolm X was assassinated in the Autobiography ballroom in New York, 21st of February, 1965. In the end, the autobiography of Malcolm X taught me a lot. It taught me the folly of extremism. At the time, I was leaning towards extreme leftist politics. In some ways, like Malcolm, I came to reject the soul-eating anger and the unending intolerance of difference that lies at the heart of the extremist mind. As a political activist, this book taught me, above all, to obey my conscience before I gave myself to any movement or idea. From a personal level, the book taught me that when it comes to the human condition, any kind of change is possible. I was in a bad place when I went to read my book in the park then, but 5 months later, now sitting on that bench in November 2008 in Rockefeller Plaza in New York, I was a different person and better for it. As people jumped up around celebrating Barack Obama's victory, one question sprung to my mind. If he was sitting on the bench next to me, what would Malcolm X think? Thank you for listening.
Your question? Your question?
Yeah. Yes?
Do you think it would be fair to define him, at least before he met Algerian freedom fighters, as a racist? He took many views which were similar to Malcolm Rockwell, and even at one stage thought about appearing on a stage with him.
I think he'll certainly lean towards that way. I'm not sure if it was an out-and-out racist. That's the interesting thing about this book. You can see a change in his thinking all the way through it. But I think it's always unfair to label him a racist, considering the life he experienced with under many white people he met who admittedly were great models of character. But I think possibly if the experiences that happened to him, like the break with his Nation of Islam, didn't sort of force him to question his results, he could have easily gone on that way to become racist. But in some ways, I guess you could say that because he did eventually come to question it, perhaps he was intelligent enough to see through it in the end. So I think it's an open question whether he could have stayed a racist. Yes?
How much do you think that book was influenced by perhaps his hindsight, kind of him looking back on his life and thinking, actually, this was probably, this might have been a mistake, this could have been a dark idea kind of thing?
Oh, sorry, you mean like a mistake as in
Yeah, maybe thinking, looking back and seeing the extremists and thinking, that was probably a mistake. How much do you think his writing was influenced by that hindsight?
Well, it's funny actually, you should ask Sarah, because in this book, he constantly kind of makes fun of himself when he was like a criminal and a pimp, a drug dealer, and that kind of thing. And he's constantly self-critical of himself all the way through. So it's entirely possible that he had that sort of undertone to him. He also had one of the reasons why he made this book, by his own admission, was that he thought his life would be very short. Of course it was. in the end. So I guess there's a few reasons for it. One being self-reflection.
How old was he when he died?
What was he?
Yeah.
Doing my maths now, 40.
Do you think he would be happy with a black president, or do you think he was always too far to the left and he would reject any president in the mainstream of American politics?
I think it depends when you would ask him. If it was like at the start of him being like a minister of the Nation of Islam, he probably would have quite dismissive and seen him as pretty much a white stooge. But I think towards the end he might have kind of been a bit more hopeful. I think either way he would have been, well, cautiously optimistic, I think, even if he wouldn't admit it. As it says at the start of this book, Alex Daly, who actually helped him write this, he said he was constantly kind of suspicious about people. He didn't quite let on till the very last minute that he trusted you a little bit. He didn't. So I think he's that way with many people, but it doesn't necessarily mean he doesn't, he's not hard enough to kind of like completely reject people's points of view. Yes.
You said that you were leaning towards extremist views.
Mm-hmm.
Could you elaborate on that?
I didn't join anything specifically, but I was leaning towards quite like Socialist Workers' Party and communist sort of ideas, which I kind of turned away from eventually. And actually went to a meeting of the Socialist Workers' Party and had a blazing row with them, which was quite fun. I kind of had the end of it. After I had this disagreement, I talked to the person at the end of it, and they said, well, mate, the way I see this is either like the two people in this world, you're either part of the ruling class or the working class. And that's when I kind of saw the kind of like, this idea of like two warring factions, and I thought, oh, for God's sake. But I was stupid enough not to take up as free drink. Next time I go to a communist meeting, I'll get the drinks and call everyone comrades and stuff.
The Labour Party still calls policemen comrades.
Yeah, of course you do.